I want you to imagine, just picture a team of structural engineers, right?
Right.
And they're looking at all this complex telemetry data for this massive suspension bridge.
Like a major city bridge, yeah.
Right, exactly. And they map the stress on the steel cables. They're tracking these like microscopic fractures in the concrete pillars, and they're calculating the compounding impact of daily freight traffic.
All the heavy trucks and everything.
Yeah, all of it. And the mathematical models they have are just completely transparent. I mean, they know that if the current load continues unchanged, the bridge is going to experience a catastrophic structural failure within the next decade.
It's basically a mathematical certainty at that point.
Exactly. They know this with near absolute certainty, but then the local government looks at that exact same data and they just kind of shrug. They just continue to authorize heavy traffic across the span anyway.
Which is wild.
It is, and it brings up this huge question, like why is it that humanity can predict the structural failure of steel and concrete with such incredible precision, but when it comes to the exact same caliber of warning signs in our own society, we just suddenly develop this massive cognitive blind spot.
Well, I mean, it is one of the most perplexing contradictions of human behavior, right?
Yeah.
Because we absolutely possess the mathematical and scientific tools to forecast incredibly complex outcomes. But we just, we routinely fail to apply those exact same tools to our own long-term survival.
Yeah, we really do. And anyway, welcome to today's deep dive. I'm really excited about this one. Our mission today is to explore this massive age-old question that we extracted from this fascinating source dialogue. It's from the Time Traveler's Paradox Project, specifically a conversation between two thinkers, Nick and Maya.
It's a great piece of source material.
It really is. And the core question they're debating is, can the future actually be predicted? And I wanted to set the stage clearly right up front for you listening. The sources we have today, they are not talking about like crystal balls or tea leaves or psychic visions.
And no magic involved here.
Exactly. We are leaving the carnival tit entirely. Instead, Maya and Nick are examining this monumental question through the intersecting lenses of systems thinking, neuroscience, and probabilities.
Which I think fundamentally changes the entire nature of the conversation, don't you think? Like we are shifting away from mysticism and stepping directly into the observable mechanics of biology and mathematics.
Yes, exactly. And I want to say this matters deeply to you, the person listening to this right now, because whether you're navigating a major career shift or figuring out how to raise a family in a totally unpredictable world, or honestly, just trying to make sense of the overwhelming chaos of global news learning, how to accurately read these systemic patterns, it gives you a massive advantage in navigating life.
Oh, absolutely. It's an incredible tool to have.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how we can predict the future of complex systems, our sources suggest that we first have to, completely redefine what the word prediction actually means in a scientific context.
Right, because if we hold on to that colloquial definition of prediction, the idea of absolute deterministic certainty about very specific events, then the conversation basically stops before it even begins.
Right.
Science just operates on a completely different paradigm.
Yeah, and the source text introduces this shift through a concept that they call the acorn analogy. So Maya, one of the thinkers in the text, she asks us to imagine planting an acorn in the ground.
Okay.
Now, if I ask you to predict exactly how many leaves that tree will have 50 years from now, you can't do it.
Of course not.
Right. You can't predict the exact angle of every single branch or which specific bird will build a nest in its canopy in the year 2050. The granular details are just entirely obscured by time and chaos.
Yeah, the variables are just way too complex. However, you can confidently predict that the seed will become an oak tree and not a mango tree.
Yeah.
The future state of that organism is heavily influenced by the fundamental nature of the seed itself, combined with the environment it's planted in. So you're not predicting every microscopic detail. You're predicting the macroscopic trajectory.
Exactly.
And science utilizes this exact same probabilistic framework every single day.
Yeah.
I mean, when astronomers predict solar eclipses or when meteorologists are forecasting hurricane paths, they don't claim absolute certainty about every tiny variable. They look at the acorn, the current atmospheric or orbital data, and they calculate the highest probability of the oak tree outcome.
Right. They map the most likely trajectory. But I have to say, I hear the logic of the acorn and the oak, but I feel like I need to push back here a little bit. And this actually mirrors a very specific skepticism that Maya brings up in the source
Oh
text.
yeah, the fatalism argument.
Exactly. Because isn't this just fatalism disguised as scientific modeling? Like, if the seed mathematically dictates the tree, aren't we essentially saying everything is preordained?
Well, I wouldn't say.
Let me just throw out an analogy, actually. It sounds to me like we're playing with a loaded pair of dice, you know? You can't guarantee what the very next roll will be like. You might roll a 3 or an 11, but you absolutely know who holds the long-term statistical advantage.
Sure. Yeah.
So my concern is, if the dice are inherently loaded, doesn't probabilistic modeling just strip away human agency? Because, I mean, we aren't dice. We have free will, right?
Right, and that is a crucial philosophical friction point.
Yeah.
But I think we have to distinguish between fate and trajectory. Let's look really closely at your loaded dice analogy for a second.
Okay.
In a deterministic, fatalistic worldview, the game is entirely rigged by some outside force, right? Your choices don't matter at all because the outcome is set in stone. But systems thinking argues the exact opposite.
How so?
Well, the weight in those loaded dice isn't magic. It is simply the boundary conditions of the system we created.
Oh, like our rules.
Exactly. It's our economic policies, our environmental habits, our social incentive structures. We are the ones who loaded the dice. So the future isn't preordained, but our current choices make certain outcomes vastly more probable over time.
Ah, okay. So we are setting the parameters of the probability ourselves.
Precisely.
Which honestly, that brings up a glaring paradox.
Yeah.
If predicting the future relies on simply recognizing these overarching patterns that we ourselves created, why is humanity historically so terrible at seeing the societal acorns we're planting? Like, if we loaded the dice, why are we always so surprised when we lose the game?
It's a great question. And to understand why we ignore the bridge collapsing, so to speak, we have to look at how our neural circuitry actually evolved.
Oh, right, the neuroscience part of the text.
Yeah, the source dives deeply into the neuroscience of what is called predictive processing. At its core, the human brain is essentially an anticipation engine.
An anticipation engine.
Yes. Its primary evolutionary job is to minimize what neuroscientists call prediction error. So your brain is just constantly generating these micro-hypotheses about what is going to happen in the next millisecond, the next minute, the next hour.
It's just constantly guessing and then checking those guesses against reality, right?
Yes, and the mechanics of how it checks those guesses are really vital here. When your brain's prediction matches reality, you don't just feel a psychological sense of satisfaction. You actually receive a literal biological hit of dopamine.
Wow, really?
Yes, and this dopamine release physically strengthens the synaptic pathways that made that prediction. So over time, your brain physically wires itself to recognize conditions that reliably produce anticipated outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. It's the exact same neural circuitry that allows you to predict the thrown ball will land in your hand. And that same circuitry allows you to predict that a specific economic behavior will result in a specific consequence.
Right, but wait. If we have this incredibly sophisticated, dopamine-driven predictive hardware, why doesn't it warn us about massive societal threats? I mean, it seems like an evolutionary flaw to have a prediction engine that basically only looks 5 minutes ahead.
Well, what's fascinating here is how the source answers that using the blank slate theory.
The blank slate theory.
Yeah. The theory suggests that while we are born with the biological hardware for pattern recognition, we are not inherently born with the software to recognize macroeconomic or, long-term historical feedback loops.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, like a human infant doesn't intuitively understand the structural vulnerabilities of a global supply chain. We actually have to deliberately train our neural pathways to see those massive, slow-moving patterns through intense study, observation, and cross-disciplinary education.
Okay, so it's not a hardware issue, it's a programming issue.
Exactly.
And this connects so deeply to a personal level. I mean, the problem isn't that you or I lack the biological capacity to see these massive patterns. The problem, and the source points this out pretty boldly, is that we actively choose to ignore the patterns that demand uncomfortable changes in our lives, specifically because they disrupt our dopamine cycles.
That's spot on. We experience severe cognitive dissonance when a long-term pattern threatens our short-term comfort.
Yeah.
Like if recognizing a systemic failure means you have to change your consumption habits or alter your career path or even just admit a core belief is flawed, your brain naturally resists it. It is just so much easier to pretend the dice aren't loaded than to acknowledge that you need to completely rebuild the table.
Right. It's willful ignorance driven by biology. We see the acorn, we mathematically know it will become an oak, but we really demand a mango, so we just create a biological blind spot to avoid the discomfort of reality.
Perfectly said.
And, well, once we understand how our individual brains refuse to learn these patterns, we can kind of zoom out, right? And apply this exact same framework to entire civilizations.
Yeah, and this is where Nick's argument in the source material gets incredibly expansive, because he distinguishes between three distinct disciplines to help us understand the trajectory of civilization.
Right, 3 disciplines.
First, there is history. History is basically the ledger, right? It teaches us what happened. Second, there is science. Science maps the mechanics, so it helps us understand why it happened. And then third, there is systems thinking.
Right, and systems thinking takes the what and the why, and it asks, what is mathematically likely to happen next if the exact same conditions continue?
Exactly.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The source material doesn't just speak in abstract terms here. It applies this systems thinking approach to specific societal patterns unfolding right now. But rather than treating these as, isolated issues, the text illustrates how they interlock into this massive feedback loop, starting with our incentive structures.
Oh yeah, the incentive structures are key.
Right, so the source points out that rewarding short-term thinking reliably increases long-term problems.
And that is a systemic dynamic, heavily accelerated by the dopamine cycles we just discussed. Just consider the tragedy of the commons in a modern corporate setting.
Right.
If a board's incentive structure solely rewards the next quarterly earnings report, well, the biological and economic systems essentially align to override long-term risk assessment. The executive gets the dopamine hit of the stock bump today, while pushing the structural fatigue of the company or even the broader economy into the future.
Yeah, they're just deferring the collapse. And the text directly links that short-term bias to a physical reality. It says that exhausting natural resources faster than their recovery rate reliably creates environmental crises.
Which is just a mathematical certainty.
Right. If the output continuously exceeds the input, the system eventually collapses. But I think the most alarming part is how this impacts our ability to solve that very crisis. Because the text argues that discouraging childhood curiosity reliably slows down innovation.
Which is the crucial bottleneck here. I mean, if we're running out of resources due to short-term consumption, the only way out is technological and social innovation.
Yeah, we have to invent our way out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But innovation requires a population that is trained to see complex patterns, tolerate prediction errors, and ask novel questions. If our educational models prioritize rigid memorization over expansive curiosity, we are fundamentally failing to program the blank slate of the next generation with the software required to innovate.
Man, that's heavy. And it naturally triggers the final pattern the source identifies, which is that declining trust reliably leads to divided societies.
Yeah, it's a domino effect.
It really is.
Yeah.
When the resources thin out and the innovation stalls, the systemic stress just fractures the social contract. People lose faith in the institutions that fail to predict the collapse.
Because trust is the ultimate binding agent of any complex system. When trust evaporates, fragmentation is really the only probabilistic outcome. And I think it's important to note, these aren't mysterious prophecies whispered in a dark room. They are highly visible trajectories, driven by basic feedback loops.
So if these interlocking feedback loops are so incredibly visible to anyone paying attention, what is the proposed solution in the text? Like, how do we fix the radar?
Well, Nick proposes a radical, multidisciplinary approach. He argues that our current problem is silos. Economists only look at money, neuroscientists only look at brains, and environmentalists only look at ecosystems.
Right, everyone's in their own lane.
Exactly. But imagine if sociologists, neuroscientists, psychologists, economists, engineers, educators, and historians all work together in a unified framework.
That would be amazing.
Right. Not just to describe civilization in academic journals, but to collaboratively map how these systems influence each other. That would allow us to recognize intersecting dangers and opportunities much sooner.
So it's essentially proposing a unified early warning system for human civilization.
Yes, exactly.
Which logically brings us to the ultimate question of application, really. Recognizing where massive trends are heading is a monumental achievement, but if we can clearly see a disaster coming on the radar, why do we wait until it actually makes landfall to change our behavior?
And that is the core frustration expressed by Maya in the dialogue. Because if we can identify dangerous systemic trends before they reach critical mass, waiting for the disaster to force our hand, is literally the exact opposite of intelligence.
Yeah, the source text highlights this paradox perfectly. We install smoke detectors in our houses long before there's ever a fire, right? Because we understand the devastating probability of a spark.
Yep.
We vaccinate our children before a disease spreads through the neighborhood to build systemic immunity. Engineers strengthen structural supports on suspension bridges before they collapse into the river. We just relentlessly apply this logic of preventative maintenance to engineering, architecture, and medicine. So why should human civilization wait for catastrophic global crises before implementing structural changes?
We shouldn't.
Exactly. The source's core argument is that the highest purpose of wisdom isn't prediction, it is preparation.
And this raises an important question regarding how we view our place in the universe. For millennia, various belief systems have framed the future as an entirely predetermined reality. Concepts like inescapable destiny or divine will.
Right.
And in that framework, humanity has basically no hands on the steering wheel. But systems thinking argues that recognizing patterns is actually an exercise in profound humility.
Wait, humility. Just because we have to admit we aren't in total control.
Precisely. It is not the arrogant claim of a psychic saying, I know the absolute truth of tomorrow. It is the humble acknowledgement that if these specific conditions continue unchanged, these outcomes become incredibly likely.
I see.
Systems thinking accepts that human creativity, unexpected scientific breakthroughs, and chaotic natural disasters will always inject massive uncertainty into the timeline. We can't control the chaos, but preparation greatly reduces the unnecessary suffering caused by the chaos.
It takes the magical thinking out of our future and replaces it with sheer responsibility.
Exactly.
And I want to ask you, the listener, to apply this directly to your own life right now. Just think about the systemic patterns unfolding in your daily routines, your relationships, your health, or your career.
Yeah, look at your own patterns.
Are you waiting for a crisis like a heart attack, a massive layoff, or a relationship breaking point to make a necessary change? Or are you actively tracking the probabilities and acting on the patterns you already see unfolding? Are you waiting for the smoke to fill the room, or are you checking the batteries in the detector?
That is the ultimate practical application right there.
Yeah.
And I think if we synthesize the vast concepts from these sources, the final takeaway is that the future is not a fixed destination waiting for humanity to eventually arrive.
Right.
We are not passengers on a train locked onto a single set of tracks.
So what does this all mean? It means the future is a shifting landscape, and it's continuously being shaped in real time by today's choices.
Yep.
Every educational reform that encourages curiosity, every scientific discovery that alters the supply chain, every single act of cooperation, and every dopamine-driven act of short-term selfishness fundamentally alters the probability of tomorrow.
It all matters.
It does. Tomorrow is born entirely in the decisions made today. And our greatest responsibility is not merely to brace for impact and adapt to whatever future arrives, but to consciously design a better one.
We are the architects of our own probabilities.
Absolutely are. And the source text brings this all the way back to that brilliant acorn analogy from the beginning, leaving us with a truly haunting question to ponder. I want to read this quote directly from Nick and Maya's dialogue. They ask, "If an acorn reliably becomes an oak, what are you reliably becoming, and who planted the seed?"
That is a staggering question to ask oneself. And actually, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought that builds on the mechanisms we've unpacked today.
Let's hear it.
Well, we discussed how our brains rely on the dopamine system to minimize prediction error and recognize patterns, right?
Right.
And we also established that we must actively learn to see complex, long-term patterns on our biological blank slates. But consider the modern environment. We now live in a digital age that relentlessly bombards us with instant, short-term micro-rewards.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Every swipe, every algorithmically targeted video, every little notification is a tiny engineered hit of dopamine. So if our pattern recognition hardware is being overwhelmingly hijacked and trained on immediate gratification, are we fundamentally rewiring our biological blank slates?
Oh my God.
Are we inadvertently planting seeds of such intense, short-term focus that we will render the next generation biologically incapable of recognizing the slow, long-term systemic patterns required to save civilization?
Man, that is a terrifying feedback loop. Are we rewiring the very biological hardware we need to read the radar simply to sell more ads? Well, that's a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems you participate in, keep observing the massive trends unfolding, and never stop looking at the patterns around you. Because it turns out you don't need magic to know where the storm is heading, you just need to be willing to look at the sky and do the math.